Dust drifts through the slats of a forgotten archive, falling in slow, weightless threads of gold. The room smells of paper and rust, the faint perfume of history left unattended. On the far wall, a map lies half-curled under glass. Its ink has browned with age, its lines faded into the colour of old bone. The researcher brushes away a layer of grit and pauses. The map shows a route cutting deep into the central Sahara, a narrow red line vanishing into empty space. But there are no coordinates, no markings, no legend, only a date scrawled in pencil, 1943. He reads the attached note aloud, his voice low and even. French Foreign Legion, 3rd Battalion, missing during transit. The words carry no drama, yet the silence afterward feels heavier than the air itself. Files around him are stamped incomplete. Each folder whispers a fragment, requisitions, rations, weather logs, nothing that explains how an entire battalion could walk into the desert and never walk out. Outside, the wind moves through cracked shutters, humming like something half alive. It sounds almost like breath, patient and remembering. The researcher looks again at the red line and feels a strange vertigo, as if the map itself were waiting to be followed. No coordinates, no survivors, no explanation, just a route drawn by a steady hand toward nowhere. And somewhere beyond the paper's edge, the Sahara exhales, covering the trail once more. The Sahara stretches in every direction, a sea of silence shaped by wind and time. Its dunes rise and fall like slow-moving waves, their edges sharp as glass at dawn, dissolving into soft amber by afternoon. Light glides across them with the rhythm of breathing, the sun exhaling over the ridges, the horizon inhaling the haze. Nothing grows here, nothing hides, and yet the air hums with a tone too faint to be wind alone. Nomads call it the singing sand. They say it follows travelers who move without speaking, a low, grainy sound like distant radio static. Sometimes it seems to echo a rhythm, almost a word, almost a code. Scientists once tried to explain it. Vibration, friction, acoustics of dry grains cascading in harmony. But the old men who cross these routes say the sand only sings when it wants to be heard. The same dunes swallowed the battalion in 1943. Radio logs from that year mention disturbance in transmission, signals breaking into patterns too regular for coincidence. An operator wrote, "It sounds like prayer." When the storm cleared, all voices stopped, human and otherwise. Years later, a single field diary surfaced near an abandoned trade route. The final entry reads, "The sand moves as if something walks beneath." The handwriting fades mid-sentence, ending in a blur of dust. The researcher plays the old recordings again. Static, soft, endless. Beneath the noise, there's a pulse, steady and patient, like the desert remembering how to breathe. The document is marked declassified, Allied Command, North Africa. The tape inside its case is brittle, labelled in faded ink. Transmission, 14 January 1943, 2200 hours. The researcher threads it carefully through an old player, presses record, and listens. A man's voice fills the room, steady but strained beneath a veil of static. Visibility 0. Compass interference, moving east by estimation. There's a pause, then a soft intake of breath, as though the speaker senses something outside the frame. The transmission stutters. A hiss rises, then stops. Silence. 2 hours later, another entry on the logbook. Signal reacquired briefly. Same frequency, no speech detected. The recovered audio plays next. A faint, rhythmic thump beneath the static. At first it sounds mechanical, perhaps an engine idling, wind caught in the antenna, the ordinary noise of war. But when the researcher slows the recording, the pattern steadies. The intervals tighten. It begins to sound less like machinery and more like a pulse, measured, human, alive. No one wrote down what they thought it was. The Allied archive simply notes engine feedback, irrelevant. Yet the operator's breathing remains audible through the distortion, quickening in the final seconds. Then nothing. The researcher lets the playback run its course. The room fills with low, pulsing static, rising and falling like distant waves. He doesn't speak. The sound feels patient, almost expectant, as though waiting for someone to answer. He stops the recorder. The silence that follows seems heavier than the signal itself, as if the desert had exhaled through a wire and then withdrawn again. In 2018, a a team of explorers crossed the central Sahara, following an old trade route that no map recorded anymore. The dunes moved like tides around them, reshaping the world each morning. One afternoon, a glint surfaced through the sand, small, metallic, and strangely polished. It was a fragment of a dog tag, its letters softened by decades of abrasion. The name remained clear, Caporal H. Delmas. Nearby, they uncovered more pieces, canteen lids, a rusted buckle, the rim of a field compass. The desert had stripped them clean, leaving no trace of corrosion, only smoothness. Locals who guided the expedition refused to touch the metal, whispering that the wind remembers. As night fell, the explorers buried the fragments again. The wind rose and began to hum across the ridges, carrying a sound almost like names being spoken, soft, endless, and fading into silence. In January 1943, the message arrived on thin paper that crackled like frost. Advance to Sector Delta for rendezvous. The clerk stamped it twice, the ink bleeding into the fibers, as if urgency could be made permanent. No one had heard of Sector Delta. Maps covered the table, grids, dunes, penciled routes, and none carried that name. The coordinates, when plotted, drifted across a field of shifting sand, where vehicles drowned and compasses faltered. The signature at the bottom looked correct, a practiced flourish from a colonel the men trusted. Authentic enough to quiet questions, heavy enough to move boots. A staff sergeant wrote that morning, "Our compasses spin, the sun feels misplaced." The needle trembled as if listening to distant footsteps. The radio hissed, then settled. "Orders are orders," he added, and folded the page. They marched. Tires sank to their rims. The drivers bled air, lightened crates, and pressed on. The dunes altered shape between glances, ridgelines leaning like tides turning in slow motion. Every hour, someone recalculated bearing, correcting east by estimation, as if east were a rumour that needed belief to exist. The stamp on the order felt louder than the silence of the horizon. Men trusted the ink because it did not blink. By dusk, they reached the first marker, an empty stretch of sand the map called a road. Nothing waited there but distance. The desert accepted their obedience. For 3 days, they moved through unbroken sand. The horizon remained fixed, a pale line that never came closer. Heat trembled across the distance, bending rifles into serpents and trucks into wavering ghosts. Shadows stretched thin, clinging to boots like liquid. Every sound dissolved into the air. Footsteps, engines, the slow rasp of breath. Even the sun seemed to hesitate, caught between dawn and dusk. The men advanced without speaking. Their faces were bandaged against glare, their eyes reduced to narrow slits reflecting sky. Water thinned, fuel thinned, conversation disappeared. The world around them shimmered like polished metal, a mirror that refused to hold their image. On the third afternoon, the radio operator reported reflections ahead, like mirrors in motion. He described flashes that moved against the wind, sliding sideways across the dunes. Patrols sent to investigate did not return. No gunfire, no smoke, no sign of struggle. Only the sand settling back into silence. In deserts, the narrator murmurs, distance plays tricks, but tricks cannot take men. Still, the column shrank by 2s and 3s, vanishing quietly, as if peeled away by the horizon itself. The remaining soldiers began walking apart, each following the sun as though it were a private compass. At night, when the wind cooled, a rhythmic vibration travelled through the ground, soft even, like the faint throb of machinery far below the surface, the same pulse heard before. Some said it was blood in their ears, others swore it came from beneath. None spoke of it after. When night fell, the desert lost its colour. The dunes turned the shade of old iron, and the stars hung lower than they should have, sharp and motionless. The air no longer carried warmth. It pressed close instead, dry and soundless. The battalion made camp in a shallow basin, engines off, lamps dimmed to preserve fuel. The men spoke little. Only the creak of canvas and the faint hiss of sand moving in seams of cloth marked the hours. A corporal's notebook, later found in a supply crate, carries a single line. Heard movement between dunes. Like boots dragging, he wrote it 3 times as if to prove his own hearing. At dawn, no footprints were found. The surface lay smooth, brushed clean as glass. On the second night, someone noticed faint blue lights drifting along the horizon. Not stars, not flares, but orbs gliding level with the dunes. They moved slowly, keeping pace with the camp. The soldiers watched in silence, the way men do when an explanation feels close, but refuses to arrive. One private walked toward the nearest glow. It retreated at once, matching his pace backward, maintaining distance as though aware of his footsteps. When he stopped, it stopped. When he turned away, it dimmed and vanished. The desert remained utterly still. No wind rose that night. Even the sand seemed to hold its breath. In the morning, their tracks had blurred, erased by nothing they could name. The corporal's final entry ends with a question. If the desert sleeps, who keeps watch? Weeks later, a rescue patrol traced the battalion's route, guided by radio silence and rumour. They found nothing. No wreckage, no bones, no fabric caught in thorns. Only one footprint remained in a patch of hardened sand, clear as if pressed that morning. It was too fresh, too defined to have survived 70 years of wind. Around it, the dunes lay untouched, their surfaces smooth and unbroken. As the men examined the mark, a low metallic hum rose from the ground, faint and steady, like an engine idling somewhere deep below. Instruments detected no vibration. The sound seemed to live only in the ear, resonating with pulse. The desert was empty, yet something within it moved. Slow, rhythmic, endless. The narrator's voice lowers to a whisper. Some say the desert doesn't bury its dead. It keeps them walking. The room hums softly with the sound of machines awake after decades of silence. Dust drifts in the slanted light from the window as the researcher lowers a fragile reel onto the scanner. The label reads Field Transmission 1943, Sahara Sector. The tape unspools, brittle but obedient, its faint hiss filling the air like the first breath of something long asleep. As the digitization begins, the static settles into rhythm. Every 47 seconds, a pulse emerges. Gentle, patient, precise. The analyst frowns, running filters to isolate interference, but the pattern remains, identical across each frequency band. Too deliberate to be random, too soft to be mechanical. It's not noise anymore, it's a tempo. On the monitor, the waveform moves like a heartbeat. The peaks rise and fall with eerie regularity, breathing through static. The researcher leans closer, headphones pressed tight, hearing not distortion but repetition, as though the recording were listening in return. Outside, traffic hums distantly, yet the sound in the headphones feels older, heavier, belonging to a place where wind speaks in pulses instead of words. Every 47 seconds, the pattern repeats, the same pulse recorded before the battalion vanished. The researcher stops playback, waits in silence, then hears it once more, faint but living. Continuing without the machine, the audio seems to breathe back. The museum in Algiers is quiet in the afternoon, its corridors lined with glass cases and the faint scent of dust and varnish. In one corner, nearly forgotten, sits a small exhibit marked Expedition 1943. Inside the case are 5 glass vials, each filled with fine Sahara sand. The grains shimmer faintly under fluorescent light, dull gold and grey, ordinary at first glance. The researcher requests access, setting a recorder nearby as the curator unlocks the display. When one vial is lifted, a faint shift occurs inside. The surface ripples as though stirred by breath. To test, they place it on a low-frequency speaker and feed in a steady vibration. Slowly, the grains begin to move, arranging themselves into thin, curving lines. Circles, angled strokes. For a moment, the pattern resembles a military insignia. A shield, a star, a series of parallel bars. Then it collapses, returning to disorder. Experts later review the footage. They call it coincidence, the natural geometry of granular resonance, the physics of sound sculpting matter. The curator nods politely, repeating their conclusions for the museum record. Yet the researcher replays the video late that night, pausing at the frame before the collapse. The pattern glows under the light, unmistakably deliberate. The narrator's voice is calm. Patterns have always lived in sand. The difference is who notices. Outside the museum, wind drifts through narrow streets, carrying with it the faint hiss of the desert's voice, the same sound that lingers in every silence. The file that held the battalion's disappearance report was thicker than expected. Between the official telegrams and maps, the researcher found a small bundle tied with string. Letters written in uneven ink, never stamped, never sent. The paper had browned along the edges, words smudged where fingers once lingered too long. Each envelope carried a name, a rank, a date that stopped before 1944. One letter, written by a woman in Marseille, begins with the tremor of someone trying to be brave. He stands outside the house each night, she wrote, covered in sand, trying to speak, but the wind steals his words. The lines waver, the pen slipping halfway through a sentence before stopping altogether. No signature, only a blot of ink like a breath cut short. The researcher reads the letters in silence. The room feels smaller, the hum of the old projector soft and steady. These were not official communications, not part of any report, just fragments of private hope folded into an archive meant for statistics. Outside, daylight fades against the windows. The screen behind him plays footage of the Sahara, dunes under evening light, wind carving the same ridges seen in the photographs from 80 years ago. The rhythm hasn't changed. As the voiceover continues, the camera drifts across that endless sand, the color of memory itself. The wind moves again, carrying whispers that might be names, or might be nothing at all. Time never moved. It only learned how to circle. The researcher had left the recorder running overnight, a simple test meant to capture ambient noise from the city outside. At 2:31 a.m., the machine stirred on its own. A thin, stuttering pulse threaded through the static, uneven at first, then falling into measured Morse. When translated, the sequence spelled a call sign long deleted from Allied records. He checked the weather reports. No storm. No interference, nothing that should have spoken. The pulse continued for 47 seconds, matching perfectly with the rhythm of his own breathing. Each beat mirrored chest and silence, inhale and pause. Then the pattern faded, one tone at a time, until only the soft hum of the empty room remained. He replayed the file twice, listening for error, but the signal refused to change. The desert had reached across decades, whispering once, then sleeping again. From orbit, the Sahara looks alive, a sea of rippling shapes that migrate with the wind, each dune a slow traveler across centuries. But one formation refuses to move. 80 years of satellite data show the same curve of sand, the same shadow at dusk, fixed like a held breath amid a world of motion. Scientists mark it with cautious language: thermal anomaly, stable structure. Locals call it the sleeping hill. Its surface reflects light differently, cooler, duller, as though the sun spares it. When researchers send a drone to film its contours, the feed shows faint indentations spiraling toward the summit, resembling footprints half erased by time. Then the transmission breaks. The screen goes white for 2 minutes before returning to static. No malfunction is found later. The drone lands safely, memory intact, except for that span of silence. The researcher rewinds the footage frame by frame. The shapes on the dune appear organized, patterned, not random windplay. Geometry, he murmurs, where there should be erosion. The sand seems to remember form, holding it the way language holds breath. At night, thermal scans show a faint pulse of cold in the center, as if something beneath still exhales. The data doesn't change month to month. The dune stays still, patient, and utterly unmoved. A pause in the endless drift of the desert, resting where time has chosen to stop. The research team called it the silence layer, a region less than 2 kilometers wide surrounding the sleeping hill, where microphones failed to capture even wind. In the recordings, everything simply vanished. No hiss, no vibration, only the faint electrical hum of the equipment itself. When they stepped inside, the air felt heavier, as if made of glass. Boots sank deeper into the sand, though it was dry and firm. One geologist, speaking later, described it quietly. "You could whisper," he said, "but your voice stayed inside your skull. It didn't belong to the air anymore." Another wrote that she could hear her own pulse thudding in her ears, magnified and rhythmic, like the beating of something vast and hidden beneath her. They tested for electromagnetic interference, magnetic fields, seismic distortion. Nothing. Compasses worked, but their needles shivered slightly, trembling in place. A sound engineer compared it to ancient radio jamming, the space itself rejecting transmission. When the researcher returned alone at dusk, he placed a recorder at the boundary and waited. The playback revealed nothing for several minutes until faint pulses appeared in the spectrogram, evenly spaced, almost too precise. Translated from Morse, they formed a single word: march. Then silence again, He played the file at half speed, expecting noise. Instead, the word repeated, slower, softer, the pauses between beats stretching like breath. The desert, it seemed, was not refusing to speak. It was choosing when. Inside the silence layer, even the wind obeyed. At dusk, the desert changes its language. The light flattens until everything glows from within. Sand, sky, and shadow merging into one endless surface. That was when the explorers saw them. A line of figures on the far ridge, standing shoulder to shoulder, rifles at their sides, faces turned west. At first no one spoke. Through binoculars they looked too still, too even, as though carved from the air itself. Their shadows stretched across the dunes, long and perfect, but the wind carried no sound. Thermal cameras detected nothing. The shapes registered colder than the surrounding sand, silhouettes of absence rather than presence. The explorers advanced cautiously, counting each step, eyes fixed on the unmoving line. But the closer they came, the thinner the figures grew, their outlines fraying like smoke in reverse. Within 50 meters, the formation broke apart, dissolving into the air with the quiet of evaporating breath. In the sand where they had stood, the team found small patches of fused glass. Translucent, smooth, faintly blue in the fading light. The samples cooled quickly, crumbling to powder within minutes of exposure. The phenomenon had no explanation. The narrator's voice drifts softly. Some mirages repeat themselves, like a memory replaying its favorite scene. Later, the researcher compares photographs from the 1943 archives. The silhouettes of the missing battalion match the ridge exactly. Same posture, same formation, the same westward gaze. Only now they are made of light. The Mirage waits there still, each evening, whenever the horizon forgets to move. Near midnight, the camp's instruments began to pulse. At first, it was a faint tremor in the recordings, soft thuds that rose and fell with uncanny precision. Each sensor, placed miles apart across separate dunes, registered the same rhythm at the same instant, synchronized like a single heartbeat echoing through sand. The researcher overlaid the data on an old military map. The pattern that emerged mirrored the battalion's final reported formation. Staggered, precise, moving east by estimation. It was not random, it was a march. He listened as the pulses continued, steady and patient, until dawn washed the desert in pale light. Then, just before the sun crested the horizon, the rhythm faded into the wind, leaving the microphones whispering emptiness. The narrator's voice remains calm, almost reverent. They are still marching. A long pause follows. Only wind. The email arrived just before dawn, a line of text glowing pale on the researcher's screen. The acoustic lab had finished its analysis of the desert recordings. Their conclusion was brief, almost clinical. Pulse sequence matches the rhythm of a single adult heartbeat at rest. Source indeterminate. Not a machine, not interference. Not multiple signals, just one. He read it twice, then closed the laptop. Outside, the air was still. Even the city seemed to pause. The sound from the desert had never left his mind. The slow, patient beat that seemed to listen as much as it spoke. He wondered if it had been listening for him. That night, he dreamed of the dunes. They moved like tides under a white sky, parting into long corridors of light. Through them came faint radio chatter, scattered words in French, the same phrases repeated and fractured, echoing through decades. The tone was not distress, but recognition. A call, answered. The sand shifted around him, each wave carrying the same pulse he had heard in the recordings. The rhythm synchronized with his own breath until he couldn't tell which belonged to whom. When he woke, the room was silent, but the pulse remained, faint and steady, somewhere between his chest and the memory of wind. It had found its listener. The film returns to the words of the battalion, preserved in pencil and dust. We march without shadow. The stars don't move. The handwriting is steady, the tone resigned, as if the writer had already accepted that no road would lead them back. Their final entries become the new narration, overlapping with images of the modern Sahara, endless, identical, patient. Satellite scans flicker beside the diary pages, the present dissolving into the past. The lines of dunes resemble the ridges of human fingerprints, each ridge a path once taken. The researcher overlays the two, sketch upon scan, until they merge, the terrain folding itself around memory. The pulse heard in earlier chapters returns, Quieter now, part of the ambient wind. In the logbook, the last recorded location reads simply, east of nothing. At the time, it sounded like fatigue, shorthand for confusion. Now it feels intentional, a coordinate meant only for those who understand the absence it names. Footsteps blur into the dunes. Tire marks vanish midline. Each trace of movement becomes the next. The voiceover lowers. Perhaps they reached where maps are no longer needed. The scene lingers on the desert floor. No people, no vehicles, only light moving across the sand as though time itself is walking. The camera drifts upward, finding nothing but horizon. The pulse continues once more, steady as breathing, until even that fades into the hush between wind gusts. The following morning, the researcher drives alone into the desert. The sky is bleached white, the kind of light that erases distance. No sound follows the tires, only the faint groan of suspension and the whisper of sand against metal. He parks at the edge of the anomaly, the dune that never moved. From above, it looks ordinary, another curve of wind-shaped earth among thousands. Yet standing before it, he feels something still and watchful beneath the heat. He unpacks a portable transmitter and plants a thin antenna into the sand. The radio beacon hums softly as it connects, red light blinking with each heartbeat. Adjusting the frequency, he leans toward the microphone. His voice is calm, almost formal. To anyone still walking. The message repeats automatically, looping through static. Hours pass. The sun tilts west. Nothing answers. At dusk, the air cools and the wind changes direction. A vibration runs through the ground, low and deliberate, rising from the depths like a sigh. The radio picks it up as a pulse, steady, fading, steady again. The researcher sits beside the equipment, listening without expression. The hum slows, lengthens and stops. He doesn't speak. He doesn't look at the recorder. He simply reaches forward and turns the dial, silencing the machine. The wind fills the void, brushing over the microphone like breath. For a long moment, there is nothing else, only stillness, vast and complete, as if the desert has finally answered by choosing not to. The desert returns to light. The sun lowers until it rests on the horizon, washing the dunes in liquid gold. Each curve mirrors the first scene, untouched by time, the same ridges, the same patient silence. Shadows stretch thin, folding into one another until sky and earth blur. The voiceover murmurs softly. Nothing disappears. It only changes the language it speaks. The wind answers in faint metallic tones, almost musical, almost human, a sound too delicate to name. As the light fades, the dunes darken into waves of blue shadow. The last reflection shimmers along their edges, then slips quietly away. No pulse, no signal, only stillness. The wind exhales once, long and low, brushing over the sand like a final breath. Then silence, wide, unbroken, complete, the kind that waits rather than ends.